At the end of February 1991, when winter still ruled the calendar, everything begins not with a violent crackle and not with living silence, but with a dead, electric silence, a cold, thrilling absence of sound, like a pause before a storm flooded with alarm lines. In a bunker hidden by thick concrete walls, somewhere deep in the Moscow dungeons, in the final days of the Soviet Union, the stagnant acrid smoke of cigarettes turns the air into a viscous suspension, and next to it hovers something heavier, a nagging premonition of death, a nervous tremor as if from a dank wind that suddenly penetrated from the cracks into the cold concrete chest headquarters. General Mikhail Moise, his face chiseled by time and anxiety, his eyes made of finely honed flint, is motionlessly bent over a map that even the old constellations of the Soviet army can no longer navigate. For weeks, he and his analysts had been watching intently, with a touch of proud detachment, as the Americans, with the support of their allies, indifferently dissected the sky over Iraq, a country whose name had recently been whispered with the confidence of a client under the protection of an older brother. American airstrikes were analyzed methodically. They were put on the shelves by tough heads who were firmly convinced of the strength of the Soviet doctrine. All the special forces of the Iraqi Republican Guard have learned is to withstand this fire. The air is not a scythe, they thought, but a scalpel that sows pain, but does not cut at the root. With physical stubbornness, with the faith of the overcoat and steel, they were convinced that only a real, meat-chopping war on earth would reveal the difference between an army and a pack of hunters. The Americans, this invisible mass of volunteers without training, had to wallow in the shifting swamp of Middle Eastern sand. And Soviet T-72 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and an intricate air defense network inspired by the engineering passion of Soviet mentors. This is the plate that the West will not be able and will not dare to raise at the cost of blood. That was the theory. It was signed unconditionally by almost the entire General Staff. But the 24th of February is the date that crumbled the doctrine into the smallest dust. The first messages seemed like a game of the fog of war, then panic, and finally, an absurd lie. The ground operation, codenamed Desert Sabre, was supposed to be delayed. Weeks were planned, but everything was completed in 100 hours. And then reality split, at the bottom of which not a single, incredible event could be hidden. Dozens of hours of continuous, avalanche-like, woven from an impossible nightmare. Throughout the depths of the lapidary tunnels of the headquarters, where teletypes on the banks of the estrangement drum with reports, information accumulates not about the war, but about the mass disappearance of armies, divisions of the crowded, seasoned Iraqi army, previously considered the fourth most powerful in the world, dissolved, erased, not just retreated, but disappeared without a trace amid the desert haze. One of the legends of the special services was born exactly then, in the convulsive lines of an intercepted signal shouted hysterically by the commander of one of the Iraqi corps. His voice trembled from the inner edge of madness. His T-72s were burning, not from gunfire, not in battle. They were just burning, as if they were at the mercy of evil sorcery. He kept talking about the noise in the sky, about the flight of the personnel, tossed between persistent questions and desperate pleas, without receiving any directives. The line ended with a sharp, not thunderous, not bomb, but a thin, screeching note, turning into electronic white silence. The Soviet military used to think in numbers, logistics, calculations, the strict rationalism of the science of war. That's their bread. But these numbers did not converge. According to the intelligence reports, the Americans launched their ground offensive with a giant left hook, a powerful flank arc, a classic, deep battle, operational maneuver for the Soviet understanding. The Iraqis should have anticipated this. Radars, patrols, cautious reconnaissance companies, everything that Moscow carefully sent with aid shipments, not a single alarm signal. American corps with armor and equipment, moving blindly, by touch, like an army of shadows under the veil of a sandstorm, appear where no one suspected. In the questions that hung in the smoky air, the words pulsed. How? Why are they so fast? The desert is not a field for fast play, and the night there is not an ally, but a predator. It was impossible for the system of orders and maps to think outside of phases and rhythm. The aerial reports seemed even more terrifying, everything that had been a pride for centuries, the through, impenetrable web of anti-aircraft guns, rocket batteries, and French Rolands was not just suppressed, but surgically torn out piece by piece, peeled off layer by layer, like canvas after a fire. In the first nights of the air campaign, MiG-29 pilots did not see enemy targets, but nightmarish phantoms. 1 minute the F-15 was glowing on the screen, and suddenly there was cement, followed by only ripples. A moment later a rocket, a fighter, was blowing to shreds. It wasn't a war, it was electroalchemy, the magic of radio waves and signal. Now, for Moscow, everything that is happening has gone beyond military analytics. A bigger question was born behind the airtight doors of the headquarters, not just, why did the Ally lose? But, what kind of system was it that so thoughtlessly, ruthlessly wiped entire armies from the ground? The new modernity is not a natural evolution, but a convulsive rift of epochs, like a thunderclap a moment before a thunderstorm. All this gigantic military machine of the USSR, which had devoured a quarter of the national pie in half a century, was preparing to fight with the tenacity of a tyrant, the past. And the Americans? They seemed to be already at war with tomorrow. Defensive fantasies embodied in burning tanks and armored personnel carriers were the only protection on the shores of Europe today. The T-72 is not only the backbone of the Iraqi army, but also the steel backbone of the Red Army. The BMP is a legendary iron chariot. The doctrine of hidden armor and layered air defense was not a tactic, but almost a state religion, and on the sands of Kuwait, this faith could not stand the test. Analysts are frantically looking for explanations. Maybe there is a secret weapon? The death laser? Superstitious stories emanated from the mouths of fleeing Iraqi soldiers, about angels of death, gray silhouettes that suddenly swooped out of the darkness, about ghost tanks that poisoned death from a long distance, about steel rain, strange cluster munitions greedily searching for hot engines in the dead of night. But the main, terrifying symbol of death was just about to appear, an image that appeared on the edge of the tragedy. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers and vehicles, mixed up in the chaos of flight with the coat of arms of the Republic, squeezed into 6 lanes of a serious highway, the ghostly Highway 80, in a motley mix of stolen cars, buses, and elite armored vehicles. They were trapped, as if the whole mass had been sealed in a laboratory vessel, where experiments were solved not by man, but by a new war machine. For 10 hours in a row, when the black night held the sand in icy fists, the American aircraft did not so stupid carpet destruction. She methodically, mathematically sifted out, plucked out a piece at a time. It was not a battle, but a harvest. When dawn broke, when the first satellite images landed on the desks of Moscow GRU officers on February 27th, no one believed their eyes. The photos showed not a highway, but a cemetery of mechanisms and nerves. 2,000 cars, wheels to wheels, melted into one stream, tanks with torn towers. The fortification candies of the war were forever rooted to the asphalt. The media gave this road a name: Highway of Death. For Moscow, it was not just a disaster. It was a message that looked into the heart of every line of doctrine. The main concern was no longer whether the Americans would win, but what kind of new, almost transcendent system they had built, a system that sees through the void, hits any point, and is invulnerable to a response. The Cold War suddenly turned into either a stalemate nor a wedge on both sides. It was a checkmate. A man that hides a heroic dream of his own invulnerability, destroyed in reality. The hunt for a solution to how the United States created this new military machine, this all-seeing fiery god of war. became the most desperate investigation in the history of the Soviet intelligence services. The highway of death is not only a military failure of the Iraqis. This is a gaping void for the mind, a problem without a solution, a mathematical puzzle for which there is no formula. In the weeks following this blitzkrieg, the Kremlin woke up the entire espionage and scientific army. It was necessary to open an autopsy, not only on the defeated army of an ally, but also, possibly, on itself. The first reaction was painful. Bargaining is not appropriate here. First the denial, then the search for the culprits. At the closed evening meetings of the Stavka, generals raged, accustomed to explaining success by the logarithms of tanks, artillery, and a mass of people. The decrees were fired at all departments. Intelligence, the GRU, the KGB, received one order: to get information about Desert Saber at any cost. They were to debrief every surviving Iraqi commander they could find, bribe any coalition official, and steal any scrap of technical data. At the same in Moscow, Soviet military advisors who had been attached to Iraqi units, men who had fled with the remnants of the army, were brought to secure Dhaka compounds outside the city. They were not treated as guests. They were interrogated. These debriefings were exercises in futility and terror. The Soviet officers, many of them veterans of Afghanistan, were shaken. They described a war that did not follow the rules. They spoke of the American attack helicopters, the Apaches. A Soviet colonel, a tank expert, reported with a shaking voice that his Iraqi T-72 tank battalion, dug into a defensive berm, was plucked apart one by one. He described it as a shooting gallery. The Americans, he insisted, were firing from ranges of 4, perhaps 5 kilometers. This was impossible. The effective range of the T-72's main gun was 2,000 m, maybe 3,000 with the At-11 Sphere missile. But the Americans were not firing tank rounds. They were firing missiles. Missiles that seemed to guide themselves. Missiles that struck the T-72 tank's weakest top armor. The Iraqi crews, he said, never even saw the enemy. They would be staring into their thermal sights at an empty patch of desert, and 1 second later their turret would be in the air. This was the first Phantom, the invisible helicopter that killed from beyond the horizon. The pilots had even more terrifying stories. The few Iraqi aces who had survived encounters with the USAF F-15 Eagle aircraft were almost incoherent. They spoke of a wall of electronic noise. They would take off their MiG-29 aircraft's powerful radar scanning the sky. They would see nothing. Their ground-controlled intercept GCI radar. The eyes of the entire air defense system would also see nothing. Then their cockpit warning systems would light up. A missile-locked tone would scream in their ears. But from where? There were no bogies on the radar. No visual contacts. The sky was empty. One Iraqi pilot trained in the Soviet Union described the experience. It was like fighting a ghost, he told his crew debriefer. I was flying my MiG-29, the best you gave us. I felt invincible. Then my screen it went white, just snow. My RWR radar warning receiver was screaming that I was being painted by an eagle. I looked up, I looked left, I looked right, nothing. And then I saw the smoke trail, not at me, but from me. My wingman had just exploded. He never said a word. I dove. I ran. I did not fight. I just ran. This story and others like it began to build a legend, a bogeyman. Inside the technical bureaus, the scientists and engineers pored over the highway of death satellite photos. They analyzed fragments of American ordnance recovered by Spetsnaz teams who had covertly infiltrated the battlefield after the ceasefire. Their first conclusion was that the Americans had achieved total perfect information dominance. This was a terrifying concept. Soviet doctrine was hierarchical. Orders flowed from the top down. American doctrine, it now seemed, was a network. Every soldier, every tank, every pilot, every satellite was a node in a single vast interconnected brain. The Soviet analysts began to develop theories, wrong theories. Theory 1, the super stealth bomber. The GRU was already aware of the American F-17 Nighthawk stealth fighter. They had seen grainy photos, but the scale of the destruction to Iraq's command and control bunkers suggested something more. They hypothesized the existence of a new invisible strategic bomber, a craft that could loiter over Baghdad, itself immune to radar, dropping laser-guided bombs with impunity. They were hunting for a new plane, a Project Aurora or something similar, convinced that a single silver bullet aircraft was the key. They were looking for the thing, not the system. Theory 2, the satanic electronic weapon. The reports of white radar screens and ghost signals led the KGB's LINX technical intelligence branch to a horrifying conclusion. The Americans had deployed a new form of electronic warfare that was not just jamming, but was actively invasive. They theorized that the EA-6B Prowler and EF-11 Raven aircraft were not just blinding Soviet radar, but were hacking it in real time. They believed the Americans could insert false targets, erase real ones, and even feed false commands to the missile batteries. This bordered on science fiction, but it was the only logical explanation for how a system so dense, so layered, could be rendered utterly deaf and blind. Theory 3. The space-based death ray. This was the most paranoid, and the most secret of the theories. In the frantic search for an explanation for the Pluk tanks, some high-level analysts in the Strategic Rocket Forces began to wonder if the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, had been a lie. Not that it was a defensive shield, but that it was a cover for an offensive space-based weapons platform. Were the Americans using particle beams or high-powered lasers from orbit? Were the Angels of Death not helicopters at all, but beams of energy from the sky? This theory was quickly dismissed by the pragmatists, but the very fact it was discussed in classified memoranda shows the level of sheer unadulterated panic. The investigation was going nowhere. It was producing myths, not answers. The marshals in Moscow were looking for a simple answer. They were looking for a schematic they could copy, a technology they could steal, a countermeasure they could design. They wanted to build a better radar, a faster missile, a thicker tank. But the evidence of the highway of death pointed to a conclusion that was far more terrible. The problem wasn't the quality of the Soviet hardware. The problem was the philosophy behind it. The Americans had built a system that made their hardware irrelevant. The F-5 aircraft was a 30-year-old design. The B-52 bomber was a 50-year-old design. But in 1991, plugged into this new network of impossible technologies, they were performing magic tricks. And the most impossible of these technologies, the one that truly enabled the entire ground war, was not a weapon at all. The Soviets had no name for it. They had no counter for it. They barely even knew it existed. It was a faint, impossibly precise signal beamed from a constellation of satellites. A signal that told every American tank, every soldier, and every bomb its exact location on Earth down to the meter. The Soviets were masters of the map and compass. The Americans, it turned out, had invented a new god. The god of where. And this new god was telling them exactly where the T-72 tanks were, even in the dark, even in a sandstorm. The Investigation was a failure because the investigators were asking the wrong questions. They were looking for a ghost, a single phantom, when they should have been looking at the entire invisible architecture of this new American way of war. While the marshals in Moscow hunted phantoms in satellite photos, the answer was not hidden in a single secret airframe or a new type of particle beam. The answer was hidden in plain sight, in a series of logical, methodical, and revolutionary ideas that had been gestating in American think tanks and skunk works for over 2 decades. The American military that entered the Gulf War in 1991 was not the same military that had left Vietnam in 1973. The humiliation of that defeat, the OPEC oil embargo, and the looming numerical superiority of the Warsaw Pact had forced a brutal reckoning. The United States knew it could never again fight a war of attrition. It could never match the Soviet Union tank for tank or man for man. So, it decided to change the rules. It decided to win a war of information. The American solution was not a single weapon. It was an ecosystem of technologies designed to do 3 things: see everything, blind the enemy, and share that information at the speed of light. The shift in perspective begins not in a desert, but in the quiet, sterile laboratories of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. In the 1970s, as Soviet engineers were bolting thicker armor onto their T-72 tanks, American engineers were solving a far more complex problem: synchronization. How do you make an entire army move as one? The answer was the Global Positioning System, or GPS. It was a project that sounded like science fiction. The plan was to launch a constellation of 24 satellites into medium-ear orbit, a web of atomic clocks in the sky. Their sole purpose to broadcast a continuous, impossibly precise time signal. To the American soldier, this was a miracle. For the first time in history, a tank commander, a paratrooper, or a ship's captain could look at a small digital receiver, a dagger, or PLGR box and know their exact location on the planet at any time, in any weather, down to the width of a small room. The Soviets, masters of the map and the compass, had perfected warfare in 2 dimensions. The Americans had just mastered the 4th dimension, time. This single quiet technology was the linchpin of the left hook. While Soviet analysts assumed the Americans must have used maps, phase lines, and massive logistical preparations, the truth was far more elegant. The tanks of the 7 Corps did not navigate the empty desert. They were pulled toward their objectives by this invisible signal from space. They could move at full combat speed at night, through a blinding sandstorm, and know precisely where they were, where their wingman was, and where the enemy, who was completely, utterly lost, was. It was this system that allowed an entire airborne corps to leapfrog a Republican Guard division. It was this system that allowed artillery batteries to shoot and scoot with pinpoint accuracy, never firing on a friendly. It was the god of wherein it made the 100-hour ground war possible. But knowing where you are is only half the battle. The Americans needed to know where the enemy was. While the Soviets theorized about a new invisible bomber, they were only partially right. The F-17 Nighthawk, which the GRU had code-named Mogul Sheik Gravedigger, was not a bomber in the traditional sense. It was a surgical tool. It was the silver bullet designed to shoot the enemy's brain. Born at the legendary Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, the F-17 was less an airplane and more a collection of flat radar-absorbing panels that happened to fly. Its design was a triumph of physics and computer modeling over aerodynamics. It was unstable, difficult to pilot, and could only fly at subsonic speeds. But it could do one thing no other aircraft on Earth could do. It could become a ghost. On the opening night of Desert Storm, 36 F-117 aircraft took off. Their targets were not tank columns or airfields. Their targets were the nodes of the Iraqi air defense system, the command and control bunkers, the central radar hubs, the communications switches. While the Soviet advisors in Baghdad cowed in their shelters, the F-17 aircraft pilots, flying with impunity over the most heavily defended city on Earth, were methodically dismembering the network. They dropped 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs directly into the ventilation shafts of Saddam's headquarters. They vaporized the sector operations centers that connected the hundreds of Soviet-made SA-6 and SA-8 missile batteries. When the Iraqi radar operators, staring at their empty screens, were suddenly told their central command was a crater, the entire impenetrable network collapsed. The F-17 had not fought the air defense system. It had murdered it in its sleep. It kicked down the door so the rest of the Air Force, the F-15s, F-16 seconds, and B-52 seconds could come in and finish the job. This explained the blinded pilots. This explained the silent radar screens, but it did not explain the highway of death. It did not explain the plucked tanks. That required the final, and perhaps most revolutionary piece of the puzzle. It was an ungainly-looking aircraft, a modified Boeing 707 airliner with a massive 30-foot-long canoe slung under its belly. It had no guns, no missiles, no bombs. It was the E-8 Joint Stars, and it was the single most feared weapon in the American arsenal, even though it had never fired a shot. Joint Stars stood for Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System. That bland name concealed a terrifying capability. The canoe underneath the plane housed a phased array radar, so powerful it could scan a 20,000 square mile patch of ground, an area the size of a small country, and track every single moving vehicle within it. This was the all-seeing eye. While the F-17 aircraft were killing the brain and the GPS satellites were guiding the body, the Joint Stars aircraft were watching, flying in safe orbits hundreds of miles. From the front, the operators inside the E-8 could watch in real time as an Iraqi T-72 tank battalion started its engines. They could see the convoy of trucks trying to resupply a frontline unit. They could see the panicked retreat forming on Highway 80. And the Joint Stars aircraft was not just an eye. It was the brain. It was a network. The operators on the J-Stars would see the Iraqi tanks moving. They would instantly data link those coordinates, not with a slow, crackling voice call, but with a digital burst to other platforms. The first was the E-3 AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System. The AWACS in turn would look at the F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft under its control, see which one had the best angle and the right munitions, and digitally hand off the target. The F-15E pilot would not have to hunt. He would not have to search. He would simply see a target appear on his cockpit map, pre-verified and pre-approved. The second platform, and the one that so terrified the Iraqi tankers, was the AH-60 for Apache attack helicopter. The Apache was a flying tank killer, but its true power was its TADS, a target acquisition and designation site. It was a globe on its nose that combined thermal imaging with a laser designator. Here is how the magic happened. The impossibility that the Soviet colonel could not understand. A J-Stars 50 miles away sees a T-72 tank. It data links the target to an Apache helicopter lurking 5 miles from the tank hidden behind a sand dune. The Apache's crew never even sees the tank with their own eyes. They simply slaves their TADs to the J-Stars coordinates. A green box. appears on their thermal screen. The gunner presses a button, firing a Hellfire missile. This missile was the Angel of Death. It was fire and forget. The missile would fly high, then dive down, striking the T-72 tank's thin top armor. The Apache would be gone before the Iraqi crew's secondary explosions had even finished. This was the system of systems. This was the American ingenuity. It was the GPS satellite talking to the J-stars, talking to the AWACS, talking to the Apache, talking to the Hellfire missile. The highway of death was not a battle. It was the logical, systematic, and inevitable result of this network. The J-stars saw the column forming. The AWACS deconflicted the airspace, and then for 10 hours a 10 Warthog aircraft, F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft, and F/A 18 Hornet aircraft were fed a steady unending stream of targets as if on a conveyor belt. It was a harvest enabled by a complete, total, and terrifying information dominance. The Soviets had been building a better spear. The Americans had built a central nervous system. The shock did not arrive in Moscow as a single explosive revelation. It did not come from a Heil defector with a briefcase full of blueprints. It came as a slow-motion intellectual collapse as the GRU and Soviet scientific institutes finally painstakingly assembled the mosaic of their own obsolescence. The confrontation was not a battle. It was a report. In the summer of 1991, months after the war and only months before the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist, a final classified assessment was delivered to the desk of Marshal Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense. It was not a hot take from battlefield officers. It was a consolidated analysis from the NI4, the 4th Scientific Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense, the body responsible for analyzing foreign military technology. This report was the reveal. It was the moment the ghost in the machine was finally given a name, or more accurately, a list of names. The report's first and most devastating conclusion was that the Soviet Union had fundamentally misunderstood the American Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. The analysts now stated with chilling certainty that the true operational Star Wars was not a fantasy of space-based lasers meant to stop nuclear missiles. The true Star Wars was GPS. This was the shock moment. It was a profound academic and deeply terrifying realization. The Americans had already built their space-based military system, and it was not defensive. It was an offensive support network. The entire Soviet military, from its ICBMs to its tank divisions, relied on a terrestrial-based understanding of the world. They were map and compass warriors. The Americans had become map and satellite warriors. The NI4 report detailed for the first time how the global positioning system was not just a navigation aid. It was a force multiplier of near mythical power. It was the impossible technology that allowed the 7 Corps to perform the left hook in a sandstorm. It was the impossible technology that allowed American artillery to fire with pinpoint accuracy, land a single salvo, and move before the Soviet counter-battle radar could even get a lock. It was the impossible technology that allowed a B-52 bomber, a 50-year-old airframe, to drop dumb bombs with the precision of a smart one simply by knowing exactly where it was in space when it released them. The marshals were horrified. They had spent a decade and billions of rubles developing countermeasures to a hypothetical American space shield, while the Americans had actually deployed a system that made their entire conventional ground army obsolete. The second reveal in the report was the identification of the all-seeing eye. The analysts had cross-referenced sorties, signal intercepts, and satellite data. They isolated the E8 joint stars. They now understood what it was. It was not just a radar plane. It was a battle management platform. This concept was alien to Soviet doctrine. In the Red Army, the man in the field fought and the general in the bunker commanded, based on reports that were hours or even days old. The Americans, the report concluded, had fused the general and the soldier. The J-Stars was a general in the sky who was not just watching the battlefield, but orchestrating it in real time. This, the report stated, was the secret to the highway of death. It was not a chaotic, target-rich environment, as the Western media portrayed it. It was a methodical, systematic deconstruction. The J-Stars operators were the conductors and the F-15E, A-10 and Apache aircraft were the orchestra. The J-Stars identified the high-value targets, the T-72 tanks, the air defense batteries, and assigned them to the shooters. It was this system of systems that finally broke the Soviet analysts' minds. It was not the F-17. It was not the Apache helicopter. It was not the GPS. It was the network that bound them all together, the data link. A Soviet MiG-29 pilot was a lone wolf guided by a fallible human controller on the ground. An American F-15 pilot was a node. He was plugged into the AWACS, which was plugged into the J-Stars, which was plugged into the GPS. The American pilot had the omniscience of a god. The Soviet pilot was flying blind. The shock was total. The investigation had ended with a horrifying truth. The Red Army was a colossus, a giant of steel and muscle, but it was stupid. It was a decentralized, uncoordinated brute. The American military, by contrast, was a smaller, more nimble organism, but it had a single, brilliant, and lightning-gas central nervous system. The feudal response had already begun even before the report was finalized. Countermeasure 1, the stealth hunt. The Soviet Air Defense Command PVO was thrown into a panic by the F-17. They had spent decades building the most dense, layered, and sophisticated air defense network in the world, designed to detect high-flying, fast-moving bombers like the B-52 and B-1. The F-17 proved that speed and altitude did not matter. Only signature mattered. Soviet engineers in a desperate crash program began pulling their old technical manuals. They realized that their older long-wave radars, the P-12 Spoon Rest and P-18 Spoon Rest D, were theoretically capable of seeing the F-117. These low-frequency radars were not precise enough to guide a missile, but they could detect a blob, where the high-frequency targeting radars saw nothing. The new doctrine was born of desperation. A P-18 would spot the blob, and then network that data to an SA-10 Grumble missile battery which would fire a missile into the box hoping for a kill. It was a failure. It was a clumsy, slow, and unreliable Rube Goldberg machine. The Americans, by contrast, were already well into the development of the next generation, the F-22 Raptor. The Soviets were trying to counter a ghost with a net, while the Americans were already designing a poltergeist. Countermeasure 2, the Apache Killer. The sheer terror inspired by the AH-64 Apache and its Hellfire missiles sent the tank design bureaus into a frenzy. The T-72, the backbone of the Army, was a death trap. Its main weakness, a carousel autoloader that stored ammunition in the crew compartment, meant that any penetrating hit, especially from a top-down attack, would instantly detonate the entire tank, vaporizing the crew. The fix was a series of add-on solutions. Engineers scrambled to design Contact 5, a new generation of explosive reactive armor. These were bricks of explosives bolted to the tank designed to detonate outward when hit, disrupting the incoming missile's plasma jet. It was a patch. It was a band-aid on a severed artery. It made the tank heavier, slower, and did nothing to solve the fundamental problem. The Apache could still see the T-72 tank from 5 miles away, while the T-72 tank could see nothing. The Soviet response was to add more armor. The American solution had been to transcend armor. Countermeasure 3, the GPS jammer. The most futile response was to the God of War. The GRU understood that GPS was the linchpin. They tasked their electronic warfare divisions with developing powerful truck-mounted jammers. The Smelch, Daredevil, and our 330 systems were rushed into production, designed to broadcast a wall of white noise on the GPS frequencies, blinding the American receivers. It was a complete systemic failure. They had missed the point. The Americans, anticipating this, had already designed the system to be redundant. The GPS signal had 2 codes. The civilian C, divided by a code, and the encrypted jam-resistant military PY code. Furthermore, American tanks and aircraft were not just using GPS. They were using an inertial navigation system, INSA. Series of gyroscopes and accelerometers that knew where the vehicle was based on its own movement. The GPS signal was simply a corrector. It would true up the INS every few seconds. Even if the Soviets managed to jam the signal for a few minutes, a massive power-draining if, the American tank would still know where it was with far more accuracy than the Soviet T-72 tank crew that was hopelessly lost, staring at a paper map in the middle of a desert. The investigation was over. The truth was on the table. Every countermeasure was too little, too late. The Soviet Union had built an army to fight World War II again. The Americans had built an army to fight the 21st century. The highway of death was not a battle. It was a revelation. It was the public execution of a failed philosophy. The numbers in the end are the most brutal. They are the final cold verdict, delivered by the unfeeling arithmetic of war. The killer statistic of Operation Desert Storm is not one number, but a cascade of them, each one more impossible than the last. The first is 100. The ground war, the great meat grinder that the Soviets had assured their Iraqi clients would last for weeks, perhaps months, was over in 100 hours. An army of over 500,000 men with thousands of tanks was routed, encircled, or destroyed in just over 4 days. The next is the air-to-air kill ratio. American F-15 Eagle aircraft, many of them flying airframes built in the 1970s, flew with total impunity. They shot down 38 Iraqi fixed-wing aircraft in aerial combat. In that same campaign, 0 F-15 aircraft were lost to enemy fighters. The pilots of the elite Soviet-trained Iraqi air, flying the very best MiG-29 and MiG-25 aircraft that Moscow could provide, were not just defeated. They were prey. Then there is the armor. The final tally is still debated, but the consensus is staggering. Nearly 4,000 Iraqi tanks, the vast majority of them Soviet T-72, T-62, and T-55 models, were confirmed, destroyed, or captured. In exchange, the American 7 Corps lost a total of 36 M1A1 Abrams tanks. And even that number conceals the true horrifying disparity. Of those 36 American tanks lost, not a single one was destroyed by an Iraqi tank's main gun. The handful of Abrams tanks that were knocked out were victims of friendly fire or were intentionally scuttled after being damaged by mines. The Soviet T-72 tank, the symbol of Red Army power, the brute force weapon that was supposed to smash its way to the Rhine in 72 hours, had proven itself to be a $4 million coffin. Its armor was incapable of stopping an American sabot round. Its gun was incapable of penetrating an M1's Chobam armor. Its fire control, lacking the thermal sights and laser rangefinders of the Abrams, was blind. This was the verdict. The Soviet war machine was a paper tiger. This military failure was not a failure of courage or even of numbers. It was a failure of philosophy. It was the final, fatal symptom of a deeper systemic disease, the core sickness of the Soviet economy. The Soviet system was built on imitation. The American system was built on innovation. Throughout the Cold War, the GRU and KGB Linux had been spectacularly successful at stealing American hardware. When the Americans built the B-29 Superfortress, the Soviets stole one and bolt-for-bolt reverse-engineered it to create the Tupolev 24. When the Americans built the first atomic bomb, Soviet spies stole the designs. The Soviet military-industrial complex was a gigantic, powerful, and effective photocopier. But in 1991 they learned a terrifying lesson. You cannot steal a network. You cannot reverse engineer a philosophy. The system of systems that had annihilated the Iraqi army was not built on steel, but on silicon. It's true. Power was not in the bombs, but in the microprocessors that guided them. The magic of the J-stars was not in its radar antenna, but in the advanced software and high-speed processors that filtered the data. The impossible accuracy of the M1 Abrams tank was not in its cannon, but in its digital ballistic computer. And this was the one war the Soviet Union had already irretrievably lost. While the American military was tapping into the explosive, chaotic, and creative energy of Silicon Valley, the Soviet Union was mired in a centrally planned, top-down technological bog. Their attempts to clone the IBM 360 mainframe computer in the 1970s had resulted in the WWII series, a buggy, unreliable, and already obsolete copy. They were a full decade, perhaps more, behind the West in microprocessor technology. They could not produce high-speed microchips in quantity. They could not write complex iterative software. Their entire command structure was based on analog radio and teletype machines. While the Americans were passing digital data packets at the speed of light, the Soviet marshals, for all their talk of deep battle and operational art, were analog warriors in a digital world. They had built the world's largest, heaviest, and most expensive analog computer. And the highway of death was the result of it, being plugged into a digital network. It was an abacus competing with a supercompute. The final report that landed on Marshal Yazov's desk in the summer of 1991 was not just a military autopsy. It was a death warrant for the entire Soviet experiment. It was the killer statistic that finally proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that a system that stifles innovation, that fears decentralization, and that prizes imitation over invention cannot compete. The vast sums of money, a quarter of their entire gross domestic product, had been spent on a lie. They had built an army of ghosts, an army that looked terrifying on parade in Red Square, but that was technologically hollow. The highway of death was the mystery that solved itself. It was the epilogue of the Cold War, written in fire and steel. The great shock that the Soviets had spent their existence dreading the first strike from the West had finally come. But it was not a swarm of B-52 bombers or a wave of Minuteman missiles. It was a signal. It was a quiet digital pulse, beamed from a constellation of satellites. A pulse that said, "You are here. The enemy is there and you are too late." The mystery of the highway of death was the realization that the Cold War was not a contest of tanks or missiles or ideology. It was a contest of information, and the Soviet Union, a closed society built on secrets, paranoia, and the suppression of data, was destined to lose. The Iron Curtain did not fall because of a speech or a protest. It was rendered irrelevant by a network. It was made transparent, obsolete, and then, like a ghost on a radar screen, it was simply deleted.